it's not just architecture that you see these signs of colonialism. You also see it in the very form of government that we have. When the founding fathers built this country, they were drawing from philosophies and ideas that were coming from the West. The Constitution is a incredible document, which I think is very underrated these days. Basically, the ideas that built this country were a kind of a fusion of very conservative and very liberal ideas. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm your host, Peter, and I have with me my brother.
I'm JP.
And we are the Pinedo Brothers. We're Catholic filmmakers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art. And today we're talking to something that's very, very important about, specifically when you're talking about Catholic art, because in many ways, Catholic art shaped Western culture. And we're talking about Western culture today. Specifically, though, we're talking about how Westernism and the world of the West has ended up shaping the world that we live in today, and how Western colonialism has led to lots of different things that we see today. So the big question that we want to ask, though, is Western colonialism. Is it as bad as people say? Is it evil, or is it good, or maybe somewhere in between? I don't know. These are interesting questions that we want to get into.
When I think about Western colonialism, or when you say that word, I don't really think about Western colonialism that much. But when you say that word, the first thing I think about is John Smith and Pocahontas. Yeah, like she's teaching John Smith how to paint with all the colors of the wind, and this stupid English colonialism person doesn't know anything about the wind or painting with the colors of it.
There's colors?
That's what colonialism is, right?
Yes, exactly. Yep. So, I mean, that's a good illustration. There's lots of different ideas of what colonialism. So that's probably something we want to define here and get our terms out there. Is colonialism John Smith with Pocahontas painting in the wind, and then the Englishmen bringing their muskets and killing everyone? But first, I think for a very baseline kind of thing, we probably want to clarify what Westernism is. When we're talking about Westernism and Western culture, we're talking about a culture that has its roots in basically the Mediterranean world. So there's the continent of Europe, as well as the Middle East, and just things that kind of came from there. And I have right here next on my desk right here, the Iliad. And the Iliad is one of the most formative books that we have from the origins of Western culture. Mm-hmm. And these are kind of primitive ideas that kind of shaped the West. And so I think that you can kind of say that the West is many things, but in many ways it's a worldview. It's a type of a way of seeing the world that is Western, and those ideas and that culture was brought over to America and what is now the United States, and all of the countries within the Americas, like Mexico and Brazil, and all across the board in the Americas. These ideas were brought over by colonists. And there were, I don't know do we have any idea how many colonists came over? Like it was thousands, but was it millions as well? I'm not sure. But all of these people coming over. And so when you have that many people, obviously I think it goes without saying that it's going to be a mixed bag. There's going to be some good ones, a lot of bad ones. But we want to talk about like what overarching effect it's had on the country that we live in today and the society that we live in today.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think just stepping back to what you just said, defining the West, I love how you spoke historically a little bit, and I think it's important to show the genesis of where we came from, because really, when I think back to where that was, the roots of it, I would start with the Greek philosophers, because it was Greek philosophy that really conquered Roman philosophy at the exact same time the Roman armies were conquering the Greeks. So the Romans took that thought and incorporated it throughout their empire. And then that empire, that Roman Empire, became the Holy Roman Empire of the Christians. And then that Holy Roman Empire became known as Christendom. And then that Christendom became known as Europe. And then all the European countries went forward and colonized the Americas. So that is an important kind of genesis that, okay, well, we can at least trace it back to the Greek culture, because the Greek culture made the Roman culture. I'm not sure how much further we could go, but at least you can go that far back.
Yeah, it definitely has its roots in ancient cultures, and I think I would say definitely Greek is one of the main ones that contributed to the building of Western culture. I would also say Rome also presented a lot of its own things that really contributed. But also, as well as a lot of cultures in Mesopotamia and even a little bit in Egypt as well. So all of these different influences coming in. But I think that it's safe to say that Western culture is very distinct from the other cultures in the world. And pretty much now, in many ways, it dominates the world, because we have all of Europe, obviously, is Western. All of the Americas is Western. The continent of Australia is thoroughly Western. And then what we have on the other end, there's the Asian cultures, which are also extremely developed and very modernized, but they are definitely distinctly different. I think their spheres of just kind of thinking on a geopolitical perspective, their spheres of influence are not as extensive as Western culture, because as far it's kind of mainly just concentrated on the Asian continent, for better or for worse. But I think that's kind of how it is. Africa is interesting because it's definitely less developed. But it definitely has some countries there, but I think that the most modernized countries in Africa are more westernized. We have things like South Africa, which has I think a much more kind of Western outlook. So yes, that's a lot. But let's talk about where we see signs of like Westernism, and like what do we mean when we look around, like, oh, okay, the United States is a Western culture. Do we have any ideas on like what do we mean by that?
Well, Christianity is the first thing that I think of. And then the Roman art, which turned into Gothic art, which turned into Baroque art, all of those different that history becomes inundated in our sensibilities and how we look at the world, how we think. When we think of something beautiful, that sort of background is fed by our Western culture, that history of art that we've had. Those are the initial things. How about for you?
Well, I think it's a lot of different things, but in many ways, like the idea of the West, obviously it's not something that is, and you can see tangible signs of it, but it's also an intangible idea of, yes, we are the West. It was really interesting to me a few years ago, when we had another president, and he went to Poland, and he was visiting the people there in Poland, and he gave a really, I thought it was a very interesting speech, because he really latched onto that idea of having a common culture with the people in Poland. The ideas that he latched onto were what we have in common is Western society and Christianity. And really those two go hand in hand. But I think it was very interesting to draw that commonality with those people, because in many ways, Polish and American society is very different, but latching onto those two ideas ties us together as something, as holding something in common and being able to work together towards something in the defense of something that's worth defending. And so I think when we talk about Westernism, one of the main things, obviously, is Christianity, but also another main thing that we have is democracy, which those two things have shaped the world for much for the better, I would say. And obviously, like when you think of Westernism, it comes from like a lot of the worlds that were not democratized. You know, there was the Roman Empire, and then there was all the medieval kings. But it's a type of thought and philosophy that led and resulted in democracy, which you didn't really have in other places. I don't think that the Native American tribes in the Americas were in any way democratized. They didn't have any form of voting. And so when the Europeans coming over and colonizing this, even if we bash on the British, where they came over, and one of the first things they do is institute their little assemblies. You know, they institute little legislators for each one of the colonies. And there's voting there, and that's how, that's where we end up getting the American Revolution, because of these voting assemblies that are expressing the kind of the pulse of the different colonies.
Yeah, it is very interesting that the two nations that most colonized or most successfully colonized the Americas are Spain and England, and both of them are, of the European countries, the most democratic. Spain even more so than England, but England absolutely. I mean, Spain is democratic, at least in the period of the colonies, in a very disorganized manner, where nothing ever gets done. England is much more systematically democratic, in that it allows these assemblies to actually make decisions over important things, and money can be generated to fix problems. So there is a very interesting genesis democratically. But something else that you said really struck me, that I wanted to bring up as well, is the idea of shared stories. When we are connected as a culture, we have a shared mythology. We have a shared understanding of where we came from and where we're headed. Obviously, for Christianity, that's very obvious. Where we came. We came from the 7 days where God created heaven and earth. We just at Easter Vigil Mass heard that reading, and not that Catholics necessarily have to take that literally, although it's fine to take it literally, I think. But that shows the mythology of where we came from, right there in those few sentences. And then where are we headed? Well, as Catholics, it's been ingrained in our mind very quickly. We're supposed to be happy with God in heaven. That's where we're headed. So if you have that shared mythology, that creates a culture. And then beyond that, there's all little ways to break down those stories and that mythology, and those become fairy tales. And when you have a shared fairy tale about, for example, King Arthur, or Lord of the Rings is a mythology. Like, all of these little stories are part of our Western culture, and they make up how we understand where we are, and influence how we interact with our world, even if we don't even realize it. Right now, I'm yet to crack open, but I'm hoping to crack it open very soon, The Once and Future King, the story of King Arthur. But that's a mythology or a fairy story. I'm not sure exactly how to classify it yet, that everyone knows about. Go ahead.
That's really good. I like that one.
Mm-hmm.
The Once and Future King. Yeah, but it's so can you you're saying like it's that shared mythology that in many way kind of shapes the. Is that kind of what you're getting at there?
Yeah, well, it shapes. Let me use Tolkien as an example. He worked to create not just a set of stories, but or not just an amazing story, but he worked very hard and very methodically to create a mythology for the people of England, because he thought it was a poverty that the people of England did not have any shared mythology. The Norse invaders had left them, Odin and Thor, and then Arthur was, I think, Welsh, or I forget exactly what that mythology, but he wanted something shared for the English people themselves, where they came from, and so he created the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, and he would write and rewrite these stories from different perspectives in different ways that sometimes contradicted themselves, because he was not creating a story world so much as he's creating a mythology for an existing people. And he saw that as important because the world in which he lived in, I think he was seeing England kind of falling by the wayside. And it's important to know you have to have a shared experience. You have to have a shared thought about where we come from in order to actually be cohesive and make changes in the world and be strong enough to withstand the forces that are going to pummel you. And so that is something that he worked to fix. And I think you can see a little bit of we're losing track of what our shared stories and mythologies are now. Something that I actually like about not Lord of the Rings, the Marvel stories, is that is nearly a mythology. They're kind of breaking it down right now, but the idea of Marvel films as a fairy tale or a mythology could be a kind of a cohesive element. And so that's one of the things I like about it. It doesn't necessarily work in a lot of different ways, but yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. There's a lot of fascinating kind of things in that. As far as Marvel goes and creating kind of that mythology, American mythology, I think a lot of the stories recently haven't been quite as good, but there has been some good things too. And the new show that just came on, like Moon Knight, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to check it out, but it's actually been pretty fascinating, and it really incorporates a lot of mythology. It incorporates a lot of specifically Egyptian mythology, which is really fascinating to see. Also, kind of as a historian, it's kind of cool. Like, oh, look, I kind of know what they're talking about here. But incorporating those ideas and those things, and I think it's kind of that commonality that shared mythology oftentimes does shape a people. And you really see like physical, tangible signs in our society. If you think about our idea of capitals, if you go to here in Texas, the capital is in Austin. You go over there, you're going to see, a giant building with the two assemblies on either side for the Senate and the House of Representatives, and then you're going to see a giant dome. Mm-hmm. And obviously, that giant dome is kind of is very similar to the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., that also has a giant dome. And where did that giant dome come from? They got it from St. Peter's in Rome, who has a giant dome as the capital of Christianity. It's the capital of the Catholic Church. And so you see like these giant domes everywhere. And I think that it's hearkening back to a common idea of grandeur that we all get. And really, like many of the buildings in Washington, D.C. are built specifically and intentionally to look like Roman buildings.
Yeah.
Because even though the Roman Empire fell, 1,000 years ago, we still have this idea of grandeur that we all can hearken back to, this idea of greatness. And I think it's really interesting to really see, like, when people are wanting to do when they're intentional about, this is something that I'm doing to be I want to make history here. I'm doing something great. We still harken back to the Roman Empire, which is really crazy. And I think that you'll see capitals throughout the Americas are all built in this similar style, with the big, huge arches and the pillars and the domes, very much built in the Roman and Greek method. And so we see it like everywhere, with every which way that we look. And then we also see the little bit more of the more recent signs, and it's as far as architecture is, of like things built in the Spanish style. Yeah. You see a lot of the haciendas and the kind of just that style of building, and you see it also as well as the what we call colonial, the very kind of more British style of building things. What are your thoughts on that? It's just really fascinating for me to see that and be like, oh yeah, that comes from this. I mean, to draw those lines.
Well, there's significance in everything. The Roman style with the pillars and the domes, they harken back to the idea of the Republic, the Roman Republic. And that's what we, as an American nation, the United States, set out to make, is a republic. One nation under God, for which it stands, indivisible. I think that we oftentimes will internalize these architectural wonders and beauty in a way that we don't even realize. So we see this dome and we see these pillars, and we probably just take pride in it. Or at least that's how it used to be. I think there is an undercurrent now where people want us to be ashamed of it all, that it's built on the backs of slaves or in tenured or disenfranchised peoples or the Native Americans. You know, that's a huge movement right now to break our pride in these great buildings, and then break our pride in so much that we don't even build our houses. Like, I think I'm seeing a growing movement where people want to build a house that's made out of, that looks like a box, that's like a packing, a packing container sort of thing, because it's the friendliest on the environment or whatever it is. But I like, people's homes should be imbued with beauty, and that is influenced by where we came from. So if we're trying to create a beautiful Spanish hacienda, that's wonderful, because it shows who we are and shows that we appreciate where we came from. If we want to build a house that looks like a box because, well, we don't want to destroy the ozone, I'm not going to pick a bone with you. Obviously, I'm not going to pick a fight with you, but at the same time, there should be a respect for what is objectively beautiful, and not just a respect, but a willing search for it.
Well, I think it's you see that movement for sure to kind of deny the reality of beauty, and specifically our kind of Western shaped ideas of beauty. But I think you're right that it's kind of undeniable at a certain point, like that we hearken to Greek and Roman styles for when we want to build something that's impressive and great. And I think if you were to pull up all the different like state capitals, it's really interesting to see like the vast majority of them are built in that style where they have the domes. Texas has the highest dome, by the way, just so everyone knows that is out there. But I think there's like a couple of them that are built in different styles, and like everyone agrees that those are lame capitals. There's one that literally just looks like an office building, and you're like, that is super lame. I think it's like maybe Louisiana or something. I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly, but it looks really bad. And so, but people, so even like today, there's still like a common consensus of like this looks good. Like this is great. So like people can try to deny it as much as they like, but it's kind of a reality that's pretty much undeniable. But it's not just architecture that you see these signs of colonialism. You also see it, and obviously that we kind of touched on a little bit already, the very form of government that we have. This when the founding fathers, built this country, they were drawing from philosophies and ideas that were coming from the West, and that were, well, I mean, obviously when the United States first started, we were extremely on the very cutting edge of thought, and it's really interesting. I think we'll get into it in a second, but how basically the ideas that built this country were a kind of a fusion of very conservative and very liberal ideas. The idea of that all people can vote, and obviously that had to change as the years went on to include African American people and also women. But the ideas were all instilled there in the Constitution, which is very, very interesting. Like, the Constitution is a incredible document, which I think is very underrated these days. And people say like, oh, it's a useless document. It's dead. It's unimportant. It's not relevant to us in the 21st century. But the fascinating and really like genius thing to see from the founding fathers is that it was created to be relevant today, and how much incredible foresight they had.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the things that they predicted and feared are coming true today. And they built provisions inside of the government in the Constitution in order to account for that. But I think you can kind of say like Western culture has obviously changed from the time of the Greeks. And so it's not the Western culture like the Constitution is not a dead idea. It's not something that shaped us and now it's gone. It's something that continues to exist, and it kind of grows. I'm not saying that the Constitution grows, but I'm saying that Western culture does grow, and it advances. And so I think that it's really, the Constitution is something that we can really point to and say like, this is something that's thoroughly the West. And I think that it's thoroughly good and thoroughly great, honestly.
Yeah, and those that denigrate the Constitution do so at their own risk. And that's not a threat, but that's to say, look, you try and write something that works. Like this is something that was written by and agreed upon. Like that's the thing that's so fantastic, is that was written and agreed upon by minds that were far conservative and far liberal. And they were able to actually generate a document that synthesized their ideas such to a point that they were willing to put their name to it. You try and write, we couldn't even write 2 sentences in our current country, in our current condition, that the entire nation would willingly put their names on. Like we couldn't agree on pronouns. We couldn't agree on if a person was a man or a woman. We couldn't agree on when life began. We couldn't agree on anything. So if you try and knock down the Constitution, do you realize then that we don't have anything that binds us together anymore? This thing exists as a document showing that we have a commonality. And if we no longer have that commonality, we no longer have a country, because we couldn't generate something remotely as comprehensive in any way. So it's those that denigrate the Constitution do so to the detriment of any connection, any fibers that still connect us as one nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is obviously a very kind of dangerous thing there. And to a certain extent, I'm able to see like the disagreeing, and this idea that the Constitution is no longer relevant, because you can kind of understand that obviously it was written by people in a vastly different world. They never envisioned anything like the internet and computers, but they did have the foresight to put in provisions that would account for great changes. They didn't know what was going to come, but they were able to account for something coming. And so I think that this is it's something to be aware of, that you don't want to just throw out that commonality that we share with each other, because that's something worth holding on to, something that's good. And just like Western culture is something that's worth holding on to, it is something that is good. And more than the Constitution, it also brings us Christianity, which obviously is something incredible and something great. So we need to I think it would be good for us to be more aware of that common Western heritage that we have, and be more conscious about what it's brought to us and what we can still do with it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, what it's brought to us is that which has stood the test of time, going back to at least the Greeks. It means that we've borrowed from every culture that we've interacted from, even the Native American culture that we've interacted from. We've borrowed that which the people of the time thought was the best and incorporated it into our society and made it what we are now. So we took the Roman architecture, we took the Roman roads, we took the Greek philosophy, we took the British rule of law, the British justice system. We took the Spanish faith in a lot of different ways. The Catholic faith that pervades throughout all of Hispanic culture is the Spanish faith, which is the Catholic faith. So we took so many different things that have stood the test of time and incorporated it into, which is why whenever someone speaks about colonialism as was stealing, assimilation, or what's the common term that's used now in a pejorative sense about stealing culture?
I don't know. They just took all the gold and
No, you know it, but it's slipping my mind right now. Cultural assimilation, cultural something like that. What's that?
Cultural appropriation.
Appropriation, that's it. Cultural appropriation. That's exactly what we do to survive. This is a cultural appropriation allows us to improve. That's how we have barbecue. That's how we have Fritos. That's how we have soda. That's how we have anything and anything, is that we say, oh, that works. I'm going to use that. I'm going to incorporate that. It's to say to not to appropriate my culture is the same to say you should go die, and literally in a lot of times people use that term to mean that. Because if you're not improving and you're not learning from the world around you, then you're dying.
And I think this is kind of where we get and we're talking about like the influences and where we got these things. I think this is something that we really took on from the Romans, because the Romans were very much of that idea of to take on the cultures that they encountered. And obviously the culture they loved the most was the Greek culture, and they took on so much from them, but they also took on from other cultures, and they were always willing and able to, and this is why they lasted so long, I think, right, to take on and to continue to build upon their culture.
Yeah. I'd go even further. I would say ever since that time, really, as far as any type of historical metric or standard, the culture that's able to appropriate best other cultures is the one that's the most successful.
It's really funny because it's very counterintuitive, I think, for the mindset that we have today, that cultural appropriation is evil. like people will get angry at people for non-Mexicans to wear a sombrero. I think there's some videos on the internet that you can find where like someone will walk around in a sombrero and see how many, like they walk around on a campus and see how many people start yelling and screaming at him because he's not Mexican. And then you like look at it, ask a Mexican, they're like, yeah, I don't really care about that. I'm not at all insulted. Wear a hat, it doesn't matter to me. But yeah, I think one of the big takeaways here is that saying that Western culture is good and has given us many good things in the Americas is not to say that there was no good in Native American cultures or in Asian cultures. It's not denying the existence of good in other cultures. But I think that kind of going off of what you're saying there and how we're able to take things from other cultures and incorporate them into our own is kind of something that really built the Americas. And we kind of, because the United States is a very kind of English built culture, and so is Canada, we kind of forget that the vast majority of the Americas are built by Spanish cultures. And it's very different, but also in many ways very similar. And it's really fascinating to see how they have in larger ways kind of incorporated the Native American cultures into their
that's what makes me so fascinated by the story of Spanish colonialism, because it is a different race that came from it. It's this Hispanic race that came from it, the Spanish Americans. I find it fascinating because you don't get a new race coming out of the English colonialism. There's still the reservations here in America where there's the Indians that are apart, and it's very clear that this is still the Native American race, that we still think of it just like the English colonials that came. Those are the Indians. They're over there. In Spain, you can't do that. I just read a book by Graham Greene called The Power and the Glory, and I couldn't stand the book. I couldn't stand the book because for him, he had this English idea that there's the Indians, the mestizos, and then the Mexicans. There's three different people. And in Mexico, you go to Mexico and it's just you're a Mexican, you're mestizo, you're mixed, There's not these three different caste systems. He was kind of pushing his English thought onto something that he didn't understand. This is a fascinating occurrence that came, which is there's this new race was real. And this idea, I believe, is driven by Our Lady of Guadalupe more than anything else. Our Lady of Guadalupe created a unification of a new race from these two different cultures that came together. And I think that's a fascinating story that's something I would love to tell at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think unfortunately you do get some of those currents, cultural currents in like Hispanic and Mexican cultures now. I think there's a lot of unrest and there's a lot of, at least from my experience in Mexico, you do have kind of that new cultural current that wants to deny any kind of Western heritage and that wants to separate itself from that kind of Hispanic origin. But it's very much, it's quite literally true that it created that Spanish colonialism created a new race. Yeah. You and I are a mix of Spanish and Native American, together forms the mestizo people.
Right. And those people that would want to deny the West would have a very hard time denying Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is a very interesting phenomenon.
It's true. I mean, Our Lady of Guadalupe is kind of in many ways the lifeblood of Mexico. I think that people would tear down Like they would tear down everything in the entire country before they would tear down Our Lady of Guadalupe and that symbol that they all hold in common. It's really interesting to see.
It's fascinating.
Absolutely.
Yeah, not enough people talk about that in this day and age, especially people that are of the conservative side, because I think that is a fact that is like the X factor in this whole battle that we see unpacking between really a culture that wishes, like the culture that is fine with infanticide that we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, and the culture that is not okay with that, the sort of allows for more diverse thought, the compassionate type of idea of which we talked about living in Texas as going up against the sort of New York, California side of things, which really is death and in death personified. I think something that is a huge X factor in this nation is Our Lady of Guadalupe and the mestizo people that we spoke about, the people that we're a part of. Because culturally speaking, there is no connection with that death, that sort of mentality of death that you see in California and New York. There's zero connection to them.
Who doesn't have a connection? You're saying
the mestizo people, the Hispanic people do have zero connection to this culture of death that's growing in California and New York, at the opposition of Texas and Florida right now in our country. So I think that is a fact that people do not fully appreciate, this sort of Our Lady of Guadalupe, that this devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, that this new race has, is something that we need to talk about more in our nation. We need to talk about more within our circles, because it is a force that I think could decide the issue, this modern heresy that we've spoken about. It could decide this battle.
Can you explain that a little bit more and what you mean, how specifically, the mestizo idea and that idea of Our Lady of Guadalupe, how that applies to the United States, because it is kind of a different thing.
Well, I think it applies very directly to the United States, because the mestizo people will soon be the majority in the United States, because, well, although Hispanics that come to the United States are, and I'm using mestizo and Hispanics quite interchangeably here, that come to the United States, the birth rates are actually starting to go down quite a bit. But white people, the birth rates are pretty much already not at replacement level. So if you wish to have a culture, you need people. And you can't they don't just spring out of the ground or grow on trees, So if you wish to continue to have a culture and there's only one race that is really replacing, then soon it will be in the majority. So we're going to see in the United States pretty quickly. I'm not a demographer, so I couldn't say exactly how soon. But within the next few generations, we're going to see a much smaller percentage of Blacks and whites, and a much higher percentage of mestizo, Mexican, Hispanic, all the other type of Spanish Americans in this country. And the fact that these people, our people, have an incredible devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, this new race that we are speaking about has this devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, it means culturally there's zero connection to this death culture that we're seeing growing in California and New York right now. This culture that's completely devoted to a brutal idea of life, which is death. The mestizo, this new culture that we're speaking about, this Our Lady of Guadalupe culture, is repulsed by it, because that's not what Our Lady of Guadalupe, that's not what a Guadalupana, which every Mexican is a Guadalupana, and pretty much every Hispanic person is a Guadalupana. That person has no connection in any way to this idea of death?
So first off, to clarify, when you're talking about the Hispanic population increasing in the United States, you're talking and kind of outpacing the African American and European origin people. So what you're saying is like looking at the birth rates and like the replacement levels, the populations. The two of them are declining and the Hispanic one is going up. Is that kind of what you're seeing there?
Well, the birth rate for the Hispanic people is not going up, but the sheer percentage of the population of the Hispanic people is going up.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. Thank you for correcting me that there's many Hispanic people that will call themselves white, but that's why it's difficult to say just races, because color has very little to do with it in this day and age. I would say more culture has more to do with it in this day and age than color. But yes, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, I think I've seen a little bit just looking at the percentages, like in the United States of the population. I'm pretty sure that Hispanics are the second largest population in the United States. Which is kind of unexpected, I guess, because you wouldn't really think that to be the case. So that's really very fascinating idea, something to look into for sure. But that's why I think if that's the case, and I do believe you, then holding on to that kind of identity that's rooted in Our Lady of Guadalupe, I think is very important for the United States then. That's just something that I think there are forces in Mexico that are trying to deny that, but I don't think that's going to happen because we've had, a couple of 100 years of Mexican revolutions that have many of them tried to quite literally shoot down Our Lady of Guadalupe, and that hasn't happened. So I think that there's a lot of hope and a lot of hope for the future and reasons for optimism for our culture if that's the case. But even aside from that, going back to the wider concept here of Westernism, I think that it is something that has had. I'm not trying to deny that it has had negative effects. And I think that if we want to, just for the sake of fairness, talk about some of the negative effects, I think the idea of industrialism has been extremely good for our culture, but there were certain times, and you still see it today, where an unbridled industrialism with no concept of like the environment is something that's very harmful to the world and to cultures, where you're just taking advantage of people and the environment, and that's not sustainable. And I think that we're starting to see that now. Like industrialism is good, but with intentionality, with understanding that what you're doing affects people and the environment and the future. And so we're not denying that Westernism has had its setbacks and its negative effects. But as a whole, I think that it's very safe to say that Western culture is good, and its effect on the grand scheme of history and the Americas and the world has been very good. And I think that moving forward, a greater awareness, the takeaway here, a greater awareness of our common identity and our heritage is good for the country, because we'll be able to latch and understand like where we came from and why we have what we have today. I think this might just be my history nerd coming out, but if people were to take a little time and to investigate history, I think we would have a happier culture, because people would then have perspective and understanding of what has happened, and maybe some things that don't make sense in our culture could start making some sense, because we would have a greater understanding. It's always fascinating for me to ask people what do you think happened? And like, what do you think about this? Like, where do you think this comes from? And people will have the most outlandish and like ridiculous ideas of our history. And so holding on to that culture and this upbringing, this Western upbringing, I think is something that will really push us forward into the future in a very good way.
Absolutely. Well, I think answering the Western, you equated Western culture with the idea of industrialism, and you're right in this, as far as the Western culture was the one that was capable of industrializing. So in other words, making this incredible scientific and technical advance before anyone else. But that doesn't necessarily, like, just see how all the other cultures, the non-Western cultures, were so fast to culturally assimilate us. That's not necessarily a marker for our culture, because it's something that all other cultures have quickly adopted. And therefore it's just as much a marker of Asia as it is a marker of the West at this point, industrialism. The fact that we got there first means that we have a lot more resources as a culture. And it also means that, well, we have a lot more problems too, because we've been doing it longer and we've seen the environmental effects longer, and we're wrestling through it. So I would say quite the opposite, that the fact that we industrialized first shows that we have something that works really well, that created the milieu to allow for a scientific advance, a technological advance, instead of the opposite that shows that we have something bad. It doesn't mean that good things don't create problems that need to be worked out and sorted through. And that's exactly what you're saying is, well, let's look at the problems themselves and say, is it that we're bad, or is it that we just need to solve a few things, that we need to work through it? There is a huge movement to try to rip down every vestige of this Western culture. And it's a nihilistic movement. It's an idea of, it's just the same thing that we saw in Russia pre the Bolsheviks, which we've spoken about, where these nihilists were intent on blowing everything up. It's the rule of the bomb, the suicide bomber, not the rule of civilized people wishing to dialogue with each other.
And I think these are all fascinating concepts, and I think we're out of time for today. But this is something that definitely hold on to, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for. I'm going to look up some new things and try to figure out, like what you were saying about the mestizo culture. But this is something, I think what I was saying, reason for optimism and reason for hope during this time. So thank you.
No, thank you. I hope everyone is having a happy Easter season at this point.
Yeah. Happy Easter season. The great thing, I think we mentioned last week, as in the Catholic circles, at least, Easter lasts a really long time. So we're going to be celebrating for quite a while. So happy Easter. And thank you for joining us today. We'll be seeing y'all next week. This has been the Pinedo Brothers.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.